Okay, let's start on the Japanese stuff. Uh, this first, the first vidcast is going to be sort of geography, but also we're going to spend a fair amount of time on social history, more than we did on China. Um, in part because Chinese social history, once you really start to get into it, is incredibly complicated. But also, I don't think it's necessary for a course like this because if you remember that, like I said, the Chinese system is very repetitive. Some group comes to power, they keep power for about 1 to 200 years, starts to fall apart, end up in basically an anarchy, civil war, warlords, and then after a couple of 100 years, boom, someone finally the dust settles and someone new's coming to power, and it's just a cycle. But the key thing about this is that Chinese history is entirely driven by populist control. Every group that comes to power because of the support of the general population, well, with the except of the outside invasions, the Mongols and the Manchurians and anyways. And then they keep power, and then eventually they lose power because they don't have that support of the general population. By contrast, Japan doesn't have that. Uh, Japan has cycles, but they're largely driven by competing elite forces for power. The general population, I'm just trying to slowly think here to don't stick my foot in my mouth too bad. I would not say that any time in Japanese history, political forces and control have been defined by populist support. So if you would, in some ways, I suppose you want a sloppy analogy. China is similar to the United States in that if you're a political leader, you have to have backing from the general population or else you're going to lose it. In Japan, Japanese are much more accepting of authority, and there doesn't seem to have been a traditional, or even today, a particularly powerful need to challenge that with the assumption you're going to make things better. So what you end up is competing groups for control, but not the general population overthrowing the group that is in control, if that makes sense. So let's get down to the geography first. Um, Japan is an island nation. In fact, let's switch this up for the other image. So here we have the Japanese quote home islands unquote. And I use that in quotes for a very obvious reason. On one hand, the best analogy I could be was think of Japan as having the Japanese and Japan and being in a very similar relationship to Great Britain, the British, English, whatever you want to call them, and their relationship to continental Europe. The distances are very short. In fact, the strange thing is, you need to think about it, the distance between Japan in the south here and Korea is almost the same distance as the English Channel between England and France. The Tsushima Straits here are just about, I think, within maybe a couple of miles, exactly the same. And of course, if you go north, as long as you're willing to get cold, you notice here's your Hokkaido, here's the northernmost of the home islands. And you go up in the Sakhalins here and you end up in here, and you get, if you actually look, you've got island chains. There aren't really big gaps of water. Even the Tsushima Straits really isn't that big of a strait. And on top of that, you got a bunch of little islands, filling up the center. So in some ways, it's probably narrower than the English Channel in France. Anywho's, so what you've got is a set of islands. Not surprisingly, since you can see it here, these are basically the raised up remnants of East Asia. In periods when the sea level was lower, this light blue, you can see that Japan was actually connected to Korea and also through here to what's now called Siberia to the north. In fact, all of the East China Sea didn't exist. That was all filled in from the river flows of China. So East Asia was a much larger piece of real estate than it is currently with sea levels. So what you had is Japan physically is a group of islands. What makes Japan critical is it's part of a chain that goes all the way from here down through here and then down to the south. And this is the edge of a continental plate. In fact, you can see the plate here. In fact, there's two plates running into each other here. What this means is you have one piece of real estate here that's pretty stable. You have another piece of real estate, which is actually the South Asia plate, which is moving north. You can see it sort of underlying here. And then you have the basically Pacific Island, West Pacific plate here. All these things are moving around. And since Japan is the point where they're running into each other, this is where you're going to end up with major tectonic activity. Japan is famous as being one of the most volcanically active places in the world. I can never remember how many active volcanoes they have, but it's a ton. Even Mount Fujiyama is an active volcano. It's not doing anything right now, but last thing I thought the last eruption was only like the 1940s, 1950s, something like that. So what you have is the Japanese islands on the edge of this volcanic rim, oftentimes called the Pacific Rim, or was it chain of fire, or some poetic term like that. But the reality of it is what that means for Japan is, despite the fact that Japan is right next to, Korea and China and such like that, tectonically, it's in a very, very different situation. Japan consists largely of mountain ranges. In fact, you can sort of see it here. What you've got is almost all of Japan is very, very high mountainous terrain, very pretty, but not fantastic if you want to, grow crops or, have big rivers and stuff like that. By contrast, and if you remember when we looked at China, look at this here, China buggers absolutely flat. Now, Korea has somewhat in common with Japan, but then of course that's because it too is a peninsula range. You can see it goes off here. In fact, it connected here. So what you have when you talk about the Japanese islands is basically a series of mountain ranges surrounded by water. They're volcanically active. I suppose the good side be if you're Japanese and you like Japanese culture, then this means that you have a lot of access to hot springs, which is the same as where I now live in Carson City. It's part of a volcanic rift zone, and so you have tons of hot springs. In fact, I live on a street that's called Hot Springs Road because there's a hot springs at the end of it. So what you've got here is you've got a series of islands. They're not separated by distance, but conceptually, what's really important to understand is that if you're Japanese, you live in a world which has earthquakes, it has tsunamis, it has volcanic activity always going on. So the whole world is basically shaking. It's shaking from something. And so by contrast, China gets earthquakes, but China doesn't have the same phenomena. Most of China is, their main concern is floods, and it's generally not water raining down on them. It's water raining somewhere else coming down the rivers. So China lives in a much more stable place, geologically. And what that means also from sort of a, physical geography point of view, it's a much more stable place. Not that it doesn't have problems, but not the same problems. Japan, on the other hand, and the other aspect of China is one of the side effects of this, because China is so flat, because China is constantly growing, as I mentioned before. It's actually pretty hard to sail around China. You're always running aground on mud flats and stuff like that. So the rivers are hugely important in China because they're huge, they're accessible, and they're big. So you can run big ships, way up them. By contrast, in Japan, you have very little in the way of rivers. What you've got, on the other hand, is an enormously convoluted coastline. So what it means, if you're in someplace like Hofu, is that you can get around, but getting around by this is hard because it's all mountains, like you can see here. So if you notice, the population all lives on the coast. Why? Because you're getting inland's, insane. So if you want to get around, what you do is you build boats and you go up, and you go up and down without the sound effects. You go up and down the coast, and that's how you get around. So the Japanese are much more maritime oriented. Now, what sort of encourages this, I suppose, to a certain extent, is you've got the Kyushu or North Pacific Current, which starts down the equator and then swings up this way up the side of Japan. Now, the great advantage that gives to the Japanese, in contrast to the Koreans, is that it brings up this massive warm water moving up along the east side of Japan. This tends to mitigate a lot of the worst aspects of what I would call the Siberian climate that you get in Korea, and Manchuria, South Siberia. And so the Japanese, even though they're at the same, latitude as Siberia, lower Siberia, it's certainly the same as Manchuria, which is horrible in the winter, is that this current acts as sort of like a giant warming blanket and controls a lot of that. Now, what all this means is in Japan, you live in a world of instability. It's a world where, the climate changes pretty quickly. Again, not surprisingly, in part because of the current, but also because of the winds and stuff coming off of Siberia, East Asia. You have a world which is in shake and bake mode a lot of the time, and very little notice. You remember the last the Fukushima earthquake? I think it was what 5-10 minutes notice for a lot of the folks up here before they got hit by a major tsunami. So you have a world where you can't assume stability, and this geographic feature has an enormous impact on Japanese society and Japanese perception of the world around them. Japanese live in a world of uncertainty. They will live in a world which they feel is very temporary, always subject to change with basically no notice. And this has really shaped their culture tremendously and their belief systems. By contrast, China is a world of stability. We saw in some of those images, you've got the greater, Wild Goose Pagoda, and that dates from the 700 ADs. That's 1,400 years old. It's still in one spot in the same place, still works, still a pagoda today. You're not going to find stuff like that in Japan. You're going to find some older features, but they're very, very rare. And in most cases, they've actually been so heavily rebuilt, the actual structure might be there, but it's not the same structure. They've remodeled it or repaired it, maybe once every, for Japanese temples, they tend to repair themselves once every 20 to 40 years. In part, that's just to keep them up to date, but also that's in part because after 20 or 40 years of earthquakes and stuff like that, you better fix that sucker or else it's going to fall down on your head. So it's a world that's very fragile. Well, Japanese don't see it as fragile. They just see it as uncertain. If you would, in the Japanese system, geologic change and sort of geographic change is a constant. One year is never going to be the same as the other year. One season's never going to be the same as another season. May in 2026 is not going to be the same as May in 2027. So they live in a world where changes are so central to their existence that they really have a lot to do with the way that they see and relate to the world outside of them, and also to other Japanese inside. And again, this huge count about how many islands make up Japan. For our purposes, there's 4. Oh, sorry. Let me go back to the other one. Okay, the northernmost is Hokkaido. That's just the one up here. That really wasn't settled by ethnic Japanese until the 1700s, which is sort of shocking. Again, if you use the parallel of England, this would be the equivalent of what, Northern Scotland. And yeah, 1700s. I mean, I think the Scots and the Brits have already gone like 18,000 wars with each other by then. The one to the south is Kyushu. That's the thing. Well, it's the second smallest. Over here is Shikoku, which is the smallest of the 4 main islands, and then the biggest island is Honshu. That's the main island, not only physically in space, but also in terms of population. All the huge urban centers are all in Honshu. So these are your 4 main islands. Very different histories, very different relationships with each other, especially Hokkaido in the north. It wasn't really settled by ethnic Japanese. I mean, you had the samurai movement, you had samurai and political control movement, like I said, the 1700s. But the Ainu, the actual separate ethnic population that lives still pretty much and pretty much only in Hokkaido, pretty much had run of a lot of the place until the early 1700s when the Japanese government decided to forced settle it by actually taking a bayonet and gunpoint, taking farmers and stuff from the northern part of Honshu and just ordering up to Hokkaido. Still by far the least populated of the islands. And to many Japanese, even today, Hokkaido is sort of the end of the world, I suppose. It's off the beaten path. I'm trying to think of a Hawaiian equivalent. Hawaiian equivalent would be like South Point of the Big Island. So it's yeah, it's there. It's part of Japan. Japanese go up there on vacation and stuff, but the vast majority of Japanese other than vacation have never been to Hokkaido and wouldn't spend any time there. And there's actually very little in the way of industry and stuff like that up there. It's never, for the fact, even the fact it's been part of the Japanese home islands for centuries, it's still pretty seriously marginal in terms of where it fits in the system. Pretty much everything revolves around uh, the island of Honshu. Having said that, as we'll see, back in early Japanese prehistory, Kyushu to the south, not surprisingly, was the main source of energy and influence, and that was because of its distance relationships with both Korea and also, relatively speaking, with China. Okay. Um, One of the most interesting aspects of Japanese society is the fact that, well, to a certain extent, again, like the Brits, British have a real strong attitude that they're really different than the French and the Belgians and the other folks that they share, a near coastline with. Um, and it's an interesting concept. I would call it affectation because it's important to remember that the British, royal court, I think into the 1600s spoke French only, or pretty much French. And then, of course, in the 17, 1800s, they pretty much spoke German because the royal family was descended from the Hanovers, I think, or yeah, the Hanovers in Germany. So, I mean, for a lot of the last, 1,500 years of British history, the royal family didn't even speak the language that the population that they were in charge of did. They weren't quite outsiders in the way that the Qing were, but certainly weren't insiders. Um, Japanese have sort of this. Having said that, the British are really big on the fact that they're different than continental or coastal or the western part of Europe, which sort of contradicts what I just said. But that's their perception of it. The Japanese have an even stronger perception. Japanese have an incredibly strong internal social logic or internal social identity, which is based on Japan being Japanese, and they see Japanese and Japan as an ethnic thing. The British at least have an attitude that they're descended from various groups. Japanese don't have that. Now, that's not saying that isn't what happened. It's just Japanese don't have that as an internal belief system. So let's go into the reality of Japanese history, because this is why we spend some time on it, is because how the Japanese see themselves is not the same as how everyone else sees them. Japan settled really late. Like I said, they're mountainous islands. There's not a lot of useful coastal settlement. And so what you have is populations moving up from both what would now be Okinawa, from the south. So from Taiwan, from Okinawa, moving north. That's again a string of islands. So it's not a hard move. It's a real simple move. Move into Kyushu. Now, what you also have from the north is you have populations moving down south through Siberia and the Sakhalins, those islands to the north we saw on the map, moving down into Japan. But a lot of this was probably pretty temporary or superficial or even maybe seasonal. The Japanese islands were good for fishing, but they weren't particularly great for agriculture, especially if you're coming up from Taiwan, Okinawa, which are much better agricultural zones. So, Kyushu isn't too bad, but Honshu would have been sort of like, should we bother going up there? I don't think so. From the north, coming down from Siberia and the Sakhalins, I'm coming down to Hokkaido and say Honshu would have made sense. It's warmer, the climate's better, but other than that, it doesn't have a lot of usable, agricultural zones and stuff like that. And besides, the folks coming down from the north they were hunter gatherers. They weren't into farming. So again, it would have been very small family clan based populations moving in from the north and also up from the south. The ones from the south were probably larger groups, but again, they still would have been, pretty much clan-based at biggest populations. We're not talking invasions or large migrations. We're talking about, little groups of people piddling around, and some of them end up moving out of Japan. The initial archaeological record is very clear. What you have is almost entirely coastal hunting, gathering, exploitation. The population in the south, we're not really too sure who they were. Oops, sorry about that. they, there's very little in the way of evidence. I mean, these populations are, almost entirely what we now call biodegradable, living stuff. So, boned fish hooks, wood spears, et cetera, et cetera. So pretty much what we're limited to is what little we have from coastal settlement, largely large shell mounds. As in the rest of the world, people would gather shellfish and they'd eat it, and you leave the shells behind. So you have these big shell piles, about the same as you get in coastal China, especially coastal Korea. Sometimes upwards of 40, 50, 60 feet high. But those might reflect maybe a couple of hundred years of gathering shellfish because that was a good location. So every, winter, summer, maybe you'd go down there, stay for a couple of months, collect the shellfish, eat them, sort of pig out, and then go on somewhere else. Obviously, you do fish, go fishing also, but fish don't leave a lot in the way of evidence. You'd also do some gathering, hunting of larger game, smaller game animals. But again, there's not a lot of evidence left of this, especially if it's in coastal settlements, because you have sea level change has been almost 300 feet in the coastal zones worldwide over the last 7 to 10,000 years, much less 30 to 40. So the first dates are obviously not actual reflective of when people first arrived, but people at least sort of start setting down roots about 20, 30,000 years ago. And this is really late. By that time, China's had people in the sense of, Homo sapiens, even earlier Homo erectus in China for what, a million years, 800,000 years, something like that. Um, Southern Korea, maybe 200,000 years. So Japan and even Okinawa, probably much earlier. We just don't have any evidence, but certainly Taiwan has earlier dates. So in many ways, in a weird way, Japan's probably the last place settled in East Asia by human populations. And that's just because it was a hassle to get to. You had to cross water. And it wasn't that great of a deal when you got there. There really was nothing to make that any more attractive, certainly less attractive than Okinawa, and probably not much more attractive than the southern coastal regions of Korea. At least for those areas you can walk, pretty much. So the first big deal here is that Japan is linked to Asia and settlement comes from Asia. The northern settlement becomes what we call the Ainu, which are the population that still exist on reservations in Hokkaido. But they're not. They're the first. They're the first. If you would, they're the indigenous population of Japan. There probably were different groups in the south, but they get wiped out early on. So we don't know. We don't know much about them. The first archaeological records that we can actually put some dates to is called the Jomon period. This is from about 10,000 years ago to 3,200 years ago. And what you've got is, again, the same pattern. Hunting, gathering groups, small coastal fishing villages. And this is the pattern that the Ainu followed even into the 1600s when finally the ethnic Japanese came up in the north and pretty much wiped them out. And very much like Native Americans in North America, pretty much wiped them out, put the few remainers on reservations, and took over their property. So the Jomon period would have been what we would have seen pretty much in all of Japan, till 3,000 years ago. Now, to put this into a context, by then in Korea you already have large towns, and of course in China you've already gone through you're already into the late period of the Shang and early Zhou dynasties, where you've got huge military political states covering thousands of square kilometers. So, Japan is like so far behind the time as to be non-existent. And this is something that's actually very typical and persistent in Japanese history. Japanese are always like the last ones to, and you just sort of fill in the blank. Now, the period that becomes most controversial to the extent that when they were doing linguistic and genetic studies and showed where the Japanese came from, even those, by the last study I looked at was about 6 years ago. And that was published in a journal, I believe it might have been UC Berkeley. I can't remember where the journal was. But anyways, what you're going to get is you're going to find if I do that study and I write up that scholarly research, it won't get published in Japan. Japanese universities and Japanese agencies will not publish reports that suggest that the Japanese, i.e., the ethnic Japanese, aren't originally from Japan. Um, so, so you get this weird situation. You can go in Japan. I've been to a museum in one of the Yayoi period sites. In fact, I've been to Jomon site too. And it's really interesting because the Japanese, I don't know whoever does museums. I think Ministry of Education probably. They talk about this stuff, and they talk about this as if the population was like hanging around for a long time, and then just sort of got around to making towns, and coming up with agriculture and coming up with clans, like they always had it. But the interesting thing is when you look at the stuff, it's real obvious. One, it's Korean slash Chinese, and two is it's like, well, excuse me, why did you guys only come up with this 2,500 years ago? This is only like a couple of hundred years before the Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi unifies all of China. And these guys are just kind of with the idea of a town. By this time, Zhejiang, the early version of Chang'an, the first emperor's capital, probably had, I don't know, 2, 3, 400,000, maybe even up to 500,000 people. That was probably more than the entire population of the Japanese islands. So, yeah, I mean, the Japanese perception of who they are, much more so than the British, is this idea of uniqueness. They do not. They have never actually been willing to address their relationship with the Ainu. They say the Ainu is always there, but they sort of imply the Japanese are always there along with them. The reality is the Japanese are a migration of populations from two directions. One of the main movements is out of Manchuria / Korea. So populations probably be, maybe in part because of the Warring States period, it would certainly make sense. You have populations in the eastern part of China / Korea who, for whatever reason, have to get out of town in a hurry. And what they're doing is they're moving to the Japanese home islands. Now, this would first be Kyushu and then southern Honshu. And they're setting up shop there. These are bringing in new technology. They're bringing in metallurgy, specifically bronze. They're bringing in agriculture, specifically rice, but a bunch of other stuff. So you bring in the idea of being a farmer. You also bring in the idea of structured clans, which we don't see any evidence that the Japanese really had that in a formal way prior to that. And this is largely because what you actually find is villages from the Yayoi period actually are set up as clan villages, just like you'd find in China and Korea, but especially in China. And so what you get is sort of a classic sort of Chinese / Korean system that moves over to Japan. Now you also get another population moving up from the south through Okinawa. So, from eastern China through to Okinawa, probably up from Taiwan, Formosa. That makes sense. And that's genetically, we see the Taiwanese are a genetic contributor in large part to the Japanese, ethnic population. So they come up there, they move through Okinawa, they move into southern Japan. So what you have is Manchurian and Okinawan migrants moving in around the same period, probably within 500 or 1,000 years of each other, and eventually end up with sort of setting up shop in Kyushu and then moving into Honshu. And what they move into is central Honshu because that's your only large sort of developed river system. It's your only, especially the east where Tokyo, Osaka are now. That's your only areas where you've got enough flat land to actually do large scale agriculture. So since these folks are larger groups of people, and since farming is their big deal, they're going to move to the places that have this. The linguistic evidence is that the Ainu are related to the folks from Siberia, the Sakhalins. In fact, they share some relationships with the Inuit in the groups in western part of Alaska, which is so this whole northern region was one population. And the Ainu remain hunter-gatherers right down until a couple hundred years ago. So very small populations and not able to handle this movement of new populations moving up from the south. So very quickly, this population, this Manchurian / Okinawan population, moves into the southern part of Japan, sets up shop, and starts to sort of do their own thing. We're not sure at what point they acquire what you might call a Japanese identity. There's not enough early sites to really be able to get a grasp of that. But the fascinating thing about it is if you're writing articles or doing research in this period, um, you're not going to get sponsored to do research in this period from a Japanese university or Japanese ministry. You'd have to go in from like Berkeley or Chaminade or someplace like that and go in as an external researcher and do the work, and then you're going to publish externally. In Japan, people don't talk about this. When we were teaching this class in the classroom, because we used to have a large Japanese population of Chaminade, a lot of Japanese transfer students. They're always shocked because they never heard this all the way through Japanese high schools. This doesn't get talked about. As far as Japanese are concerned, early Japanese history is Japanese being Japanese. It's just part of the way they identify themselves. Now, the interesting, a classic example of this sort of delay, delay, I don't know a better term, procrastination, is that technology occurs really late in Japan. Now we have a great example. Chinese are, like I said, Chinese are incredibly practical, but they're also incredibly anal because you have bureaucracy so early. So in the sort of middle late Han Dynasty, so this is like we're already in the second Chinese imperial dynasty. The Chinese are having problems not so much with pirates, but the Chinese imperial court wants to know what's going on in the world around them. I think because they're afraid that if they're not paying attention, they might get ambushed or mugged by someone. So they send out folks to the areas around China to sort of figure out what's going on. Now we'd call them intelligence gathering or spies or whatever. So they send a huge number of people to Korea, for example. In fact, Chinese get heavily involved almost from then on, off and on in Korean politics all the time. They also send a few folks out to Japan. And then these guys have to, not surprisingly, they send reports back to the imperial bureaucracy in China. We actually have these. I actually saw part of one of the reports. It's on display at the Shanxi Provincial Museum. It's so cool to actually look at something that's written in bamboo strips. So they take bamboo, split it, and you write on the bamboo just like we'd use paper now. The great advantage of bamboo is really durable. So we actually have part of this report. It's a copy, so it's not the one written from Japan. But it's surreal to actually look at something that was written, 1900 years ago, 1800 years ago, from someone in Japan to the imperial court in China, who then copied it down and stashed it away in a jar or something like that. And we can still look at it now. It's surreal to look at something that old. And it's part of a bureaucracy. It would be in a library, it'd be in Chaminade, it'd be in Sullivan Library at Chaminade, or the state archives or something. So anywho's, and so what we have is this description of what southern Honshu was like, southwest Honshu, right across, if you would, Tsushima Straits from Korea, that part, at 200 Christian era, so about 1800 years ago. And so what they say, it was called Wa. So that's what the Chinese who are speaking Han Chinese, that's what it sounded like, Wa. And they say it was ruled by a lady. She's a sorceress. So we'd call him a shaman. Her name was Pimiko. And they have a lot of real interesting details about Pimiko in the system. Pimiko lived in a tower. Pimiko was surrounded by a group of female attendants, basically priestesses. People did not interact with her, so she was almost entirely isolated. Is it Rapunzel? I can never remember what that Grimm's fairy tale is about the lady up on the tower, anyways. So she's up in this tower. She oversees everything. So she gives out proclamations like, do this, do that. This is going to happen. That's going to happen. So she's running the system, but she's not visible. What you have is a guy, basically I guess you'd call him a prime minister, but he's also an interpreter. Because there's sort of an assumption of the Chinese thing that they never actually met her, of course. They weren't allowed to, but there was an assumption, or at least they were told, she didn't speak regular Japanese. So the interpreter and the priestesses had to basically interpret what she said into, Japanese. Actually, in the same way the Delphic Oracle didn't speak in Greek, she spoke in riddles, and then they had priestesses would interpret the sayings. So very similar. So there's this huge distance between the lady in charge and the system. And this prime minister, this guy, notice here it's a male, was the one that actually ran the system because it would be like, well, Pimiko told me, so this is what you guys should do. And you couldn't exactly go and send Pimiko an email or text her and say, is this right? So everything's run by her. Chinese are just shaking their head. I mean, it's really funny when you look at the translations of this because they're sort of like, what the hell? It's like no emperor, no ruling family, entire isolation. No one ever sees this lady. And yet she runs this small state, small country, of which I think they said were 12 or something in the southern in Japan at the time, which would have been Kyushu and southern Honshu. So she wasn't the only one. She's just this is the one they interacted with. They hung around there, I guess. They were very critical. The Japanese ate with their fingers. By this time in Chinese history, Chinese had chopsticks for. We're having an argument back at the institute. I think the guys at the Shanxi Institute were thinking that the Chinese had chopsticks for maybe 3,000 to 5,000 years by then. I think it's probably longer personally, just because bamboo is such a practical plant. But anyways, so they were horrified at the fact that the Japanese were such sort of peasant savages that they ate with their fingers. The Japanese didn't have good silk or other stuff like that, so technologically they were way behind the chart. They largely farmed with stone tools and stone plows. Chinese were shaking their heads. They'd had bronze plows and stuff like that for like 900 years by then. What else was there? Everyone had to go in full prostration when Pimiko or any of the priestesses or the prime minister passed. Chinese didn't understand this. Chinese bow, but usually what you do is you clasp your hand in front and bend your head over. This prostration actually is very similar to what you see in the Pacific, in much of the Pacific, still till very recently. If a high chief or a DEI Nui or someone else went by, everyone of lower rank was expected to totally like hit the ground. And to the Chinese, the Japanese actually hit the ground. In other words, you had to lay flat on the ground. If you didn't, you were killed on the spot. So the Chinese are sort of mystified by these behaviors. Well, that was the last one. The Chinese are horrified by the fact that the Japanese all have tatau. The Japanese are all tattooed. Now, Koreans didn't do tatau particularly. You did, and some groups did small tatau. But the group that was really big on tatau is Taiwan and Okinawans. Were very big on tatau. And that's not surprisingly that populations out of that part of the world settle in the Pacific and become your Pacific Islands, specifically like Polynesians and such. So tatau has a history of thousands of years in the Pacific, right down till today in Hawaii and with the Maori and New Zealand and stuff. And the Japanese had the same thing. It was always blue, which again actually was just typical in the Western Pacific. Anyways, so the Chinese were horrified. The Chinese don't do tatau, haven't since the pre-Shang dynasty. There's some tatau, but after that, just not at all. So the Chinese that found themselves stuck in Western Japan thought like they had fallen off the end of the world, socially, culturally, sophistication-wise. And the guys make no bones about it. They just go off on how primitive the Japanese were. And this is we're already in the second period of Chinese imperial history. Just some idea of the gap in time here. Now, what happens then is there's a second sequence of change. The first sequence of change is this Jomon. So the Jomon period, is your hunting, gather small villages. The Yayoi period is where you start to get the idea of, I wouldn't call them towns, but I'd certainly call them large villages. There becomes more central authority structured in the clan. And this is down to about, this is what the Chinese saw, that was the end of the Yayoi period. After the Chinese, and I wouldn't be too surprised if it has something to do with it, because you have to remember, for every Chinese bureaucrat that's going over there, Chinese are great merchants. And despite the fact that the Chinese government has never been particularly interested in the ocean, the Chinese as sailors are actually been, sort of at the cutting edge of technology right into the 1400s. So, there were probably a ton of Chinese sailing up and down the coast of Japan, trading for fish, trading for this, trading for that. Koreans also, but to a lesser extent. And so what you had was a fair amount of informal or casual interaction going on. In all this, what happens is that right around the period the Chinese are showing up formally in Japan, but a little bit later, you end up with a huge dramatic change in Japanese society, socially and politically. This is called the Yamato period. It's also called the Gofun period because these burial mounds are called Gofun. They look like keys. Um, Now, we're not sure if this was the population that was already identified as ethnic Japanese who start making these changes internally, or if there's a second wave of migration coming up, either from the south, from Okinawa, or from Korea. Maybe a combination. My guess would be sort of a combination of the two. But what happens in this period is, and the Yamato period is famous because this period, which goes for about 400 or 500 years, is when Japan becomes Japanese. A lot of aspects of the Yamato period changes are still extended in Japan today. Now, I suppose this isn't saying much since the Chinese have been Han Chinese since by then for what, 500-600 years under the first emperor. So, but anyways, so we'll go into a little bit of this and we're going to stop. So what does the Yamato period look like in terms of change? One, you have a term which is still used in Japan. I'm going to mispronounce this because I can't do the pitches right. This is the idea of uji, which is the idea of a clan. So the clans become key. The head of the clan becomes the jiazhang. Well, the Japanese have a different term for it. I can only remember the Chinese. So he's the head of the family. He's also the interface between the living members of the family and the ancestors and other spirits. So exactly the same as the Chinese. There's absolutely no difference except they put different terms on it. Where it becomes trippy is that whereas in the Chinese sense, everyone's part of a clan, and every clan has relationships. This is that rectification of name. Everyone in a Chinese clan, everyone below obeys those above. Everyone above is supposed to be responsible for those below. Think of the classic Confucian logic. In Japan, that gets entirely morphed into something totally different. In Japan, outside of the senior lineage of the family, in other words, the folks that can trace themselves to this guy in charge. So there'll be one or two family branches or parts of the family tree that happens. Everyone else who isn't part of that family tree becomes, for all technical terms, a peasant. They become what's called bei. And there's no English translation for this word. They're the workers, they're peasants. They are there by virtue of where they live. They're there by virtue of what they do, blacksmith, farmer, whatever it might be. The family is seen and defined as the people who live under the same roof. The bei are the folks that live in the roofs around them. So what happens is right from the get-go in the Japanese system, unlike the Chinese system where everyone belongs to a clan, in the Japanese system, only elite family lineages belong to the clan in the sense they have that last name. The vast majority of Japanese don't. Now, one of the ways you classically see this is right down until the 1800s, is the vast majority of Japanese didn't have last names. So whereas in China, right down till today, you identify with your family or last name, that's your clan. Zhang, Zhou, whatever it might be. In Japan, the vast majority of folks would identify with whoever their clan was that they were affiliated with. In other words, who the folks they worked for. Like in the modern term, I work for Fujitsu, or I work for Mitsubishi, or where you lived. I live in Takayama, but that really wouldn't be your name. You weren't given a last name. You only had an identity name. You had basically a first name or a nickname. So for the vast majority of the population, there was no hereditary clan relationship. The vast majority of the population is just peasants, what the Russians would call serfs. And this is really early on. Other Chinese records from the Wei dynasty in 600-700 AD talk about this because it really struck them as being odd. They didn't understand it. Now you see something like this in Korea. I've never quite spent enough time with Korean history to understand this, but my understanding is for a lot of the population in Korea by a little bit later, by about 800 or 900 AD, a lot of the population are basically equivalent of Be. They're just workers or residents. They're not hereditarily tied to clans. So clans in Japan, the uchi, become fairly elitist. They're in charge of property. They own a particular, they control or own a particular chunk of real estate. Now, within this context, of course, the logic argument is that the ancestors of that clan actually own the property. The living members are just the ones managing it. So in that regard, it'd be exactly the same as, say, the Hawaiian traditional land system. Now, what happens in Japan is these clans start to coalesce. So clans get together, clans gather in like what we call ultra clans or super clans, and so they end up controlling more folks. And eventually, these clans start going at it. Why? Who knows? History. You'd have to go back in a time machine. But anyways, by 700 AD, these clans are going at it big time in pretty large scale warfare. When the dust settles in Japan, a particular clan has ended up in charge of northern Kyushu and basically central southern Honshu. This is the Yamato clan. They trace their descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. So they see their ancestor as being the sun, and she made people, and the people are the Uji that are the Yamato. Now, where this becomes really key is then in Japanese sort of social mythology or social history, is that when the Yamato come to power, they come to power because, of course, Amaterasu is more powerful than the other clan ancestors. Therefore, their clan's going to beat the other clans when they're in battle. They have more monarchy or whatever you want to phrase it as. The guy that's head of the Yamato clan when they come to power in central southern Japan is called Jimmu. And he becomes the first emperor, the Emperor Jimmu. Now, what makes this different than China, or almost, well, in fact, it's, as far as I know, unique in world history, is the current emperor. Akihito is now retired, so I can't remember the new guy's name. The current Japanese emperor in 2026 living in Tokyo is a direct descendant from the Emperor Jimmu. So the Japanese imperial line goes back for 1,500 years without a break. And what that means is in one way, shape, or form, the Yamato clan have, at least in many ways superficially, but at least superficially have been in charge of the Empire of Japan, the country of Japan, since 700 AD. This is one reason why the Japanese, despite all the social political changes, this is still why you see the Hinomaru, the rising sun on the Japanese flag. That's actually showing the Japanese population's relationship and reverence for the sun goddess Amaterasu, who is, of course, their goddess. So, you don't have these breaks. It's not like the Chinese system where one dynasty disappears and another one goes to charge. In Japan, you have this enormous continuity between this one family and at least in some ways, what you might call ritual control of Japanese society. Now, among other things, what this means is Japanese relationship both with Shinto, the Japanese home religion, and also with belief systems is very different than the Chinese or even the Korean because it's grounded in this relationship. The Japanese in 2026 still see themselves as the indirect descendants, because they're not part of the right family, of Amaterasu. The imperial family in Tokyo and the imperial palace is still the direct descendants of Amaterasu. There's no break there. Now, what that means to a large extent is one chunk of Chinese or Japanese religion has persisted almost without change for 1,600 years. And that's directly tied to social political leadership. Having said that, what we're going to see is that just because you have control in the sense that your family's in power doesn't mean you actually manage stuff. So again, if you think about it, if you want to put a context, to a certain extent, the imperial family becomes like the post, or pre-Yamato period version of Pimiko and the sorceress slash shaman. They are ritually in charge of aspects of Japanese society, still are, but they don't actually run the country any more than you could argue she did. It wasn't she didn't run the country; the prime minister did. Her interpreter did. In the same way, in Japanese history, what you find is almost never, with the exception of the Meiji Emperor coming to power in 1870, the imperial family, the Yamato clan, almost never has any authority in Japanese politics. That's always done by other groups. Almost invariably, however, couching themselves as being the advisors, counselors, or protectors of the imperial family. So rather than whacking the family in power and taking in charge, which is the Chinese system and a large part of the Korean system, in the Japanese system, what you do is you keep the imperial family around and you become their new bodyguards. And you put them in the tower, and then you tell everyone else, well, these guys, they're so precious. We're going to make sure the Yamato can't get hurt. So therefore, we're going to protect them from you. So we're going to tell you how things are going and what you're going to do, because we're going to interpret for the Yamato clan. So we know what's best for you and we know what's best for them. So you end up with ritual power, but for all intents and purposes, no political power. And this is Japanese history right down till today. One of the other side effects of this, and again, because of this idea of hierarchy, but also because clan plays out entirely different in Japanese society. This is one of the reasons why the Japanese language is so difficult for anyone to actually acquire, is that in Japanese society, no two individuals have the same social rank. Everyone is a little bit higher or a little bit lower, maybe a lot higher or lower, than anyone else they interact with. And so in Japanese society, interacting with strangers means that you use a particular type of Japanese that's called neutral Japanese, that basically doesn't include social rank because you don't know. The minute you find out, they'll switch the way they talk. I can't understand the switches, but I can hear the switches. You can hear when they switch into the rank system, because the way that the prefacing and prefixes to words change. So Japanese really dislike interacting with someone they don't know because they don't know what the rank is. And it makes them incredibly uncomfortable, because in Japanese society, everyone's either higher or lower than anyone else they're talking to. As you can imagine, this makes things incredibly complicated. And the Japanese do this through linguistics, almost never through dress. So when you're listening to people talk, if you understand enough Japanese, you can actually tell who's higher in the social pecking order just by virtue of the way they phrase stuff with each other. Now, you're also going to get this in more visible forms like bowing and stuff like that. But the main thing is just audio. It's linguistic. Okay, so let's pause for a second here. This is an example of the continuity. This is the Sumiyoshi Taisha Shrine in Osaka. It's one of the oldest shrines in Japan. It's an imperial shrine. So it's actually for the use and consumption by the imperial family. It's one of the most conservative shrines that I know of, actually more so than almost all the ones in Kyoto, which is technically the capital. I mean, at least socially, it's still the capital in Japan. But we happened to be there one day, what we were doing there. Anyways, we happened to be there one day when there was a wedding going by. Now, the only folks, from what I understand, talking to one of the ladies, one of the attendants, dressed like her, is that, as far as I could understand what she was saying, it wasn't, again, the folks at this place, even the ones that work there, tend to speak very formal, which is oftentimes called Imperial Japanese. They've modified it so that otherwise it can't be understood. Imperial Japanese can't be understood by regular Japanese. It's almost entirely different dialect. But she, it was close enough you could figure out you can't have a marriage ceremony here unless you're linked with the actual Yamato clan. So it's not like, you go to a wedding chapel and set up a time and a place, or even in Japan, other temples, they don't always do weddings. That's usually done at wedding halls, but they don't particularly care. Here, the only folks that can be here are members of the extended Yamato clan. Now, mind you, that's, I would guess probably about 10,000 people would be my guess. Now, what that means is the guy here and his new wife here are, well, he has to, by definition, he has to be a member of the Yamato clan. So these are members of the imperial family. They're not like next in line. No one was important. There were no bodyguards running around. So these guys weren't somebody. Um, but but you can see the formal outfits here are very, granted the followers on are all in modern outfits, but everyone else here is in the same outfits they would have had, 1,000 years ago. The temple maidens here are the clash of temple maidens out, and here's the high priest. The couples here, as I mentioned before, I think I mentioned before, in Asian societies, white is the color of purity, but it's also the color of death. You bury people in white outfits. Now, there's an interesting piece of symbolism when you think about it. There's a reason the bride is wearing white. I'll give you 5 seconds to figure out what it is. One, two. Okay. It's because she's leaving her family of birth and she's moving into her husband's family. So, to a certain extent, in the Japanese view, which is pretty blunt, she's dead to her family now. She's committed to his family. Um, I'm not sure that modern Japanese quite see it that way, but again, this is the imperial family. So this is done in traditional style. You can see this in the attendance kimonos that the ladies are wearing. This particular, again, the lady was trying to explain it to us, these brocade patterns that the ladies have here and the obi that they're wearing are unique to Sumiyoshi Taisha. And they were actually, they got those patterns were given to them, I can't remember if she said 500 or 600 years ago, by the imperial family. Here's what you guys are going to wear, and this is what it looks like. And that's still what you wear. So these structures, even though they rebuild these temples, I think she said every 40 or 50 years, so they rebuild the roofs and stuff. But they always keep part of the main beams are intact. And this structure is exactly the same as you would have seen back when it was originally put up in probably like 900 AD. And they're doing, to a certain extent, a lot of the ceremonies exactly the same ceremonies you would have done in 900 AD. The umbrella is classically Korean. The outfits are actually, in fact, the temple maidens' outfits are actually classically Han Chinese or Tong China. The priest outfit is classically shamanistic Korean. The kimono that the women are wearing is a version of what the Tong fancy women wore in the imperial courts. It's not as fancy, it's not as pretty, to be honest, but it's part of the same thing. So again, a large part of what you see here is actually borrowed in the sense that it came from somewhere else. Now, these folks would be stunningly, irritated and really disgusted if you tried to point it out to them, and they wouldn't buy it. As far as the Japanese are concerned, everything about this is uniquely Japanese. It's always been Japanese. It's always going to be Japanese. So this, on one hand, borrowed, but on the other hand, perceptually not borrowed. Continuity back to 900 AD, and this particular entirely by accident situation. These are actually folks of that same clan that goes back somewhere here. Him and let's see, that would have to be the. I'm not sure who the dad is here. I think that'd be his dad. Maybe this hard to tell. No. That'd be the dad and mom back here. So that'd be his parents. The dad is a member of that clan and can trace descent directly back to the Yamato taking power in Japan back in 700 AD, whatever it was. And in some way, shape, or form, he's related, like the eighth cousin or something like that to the current emperor of Japan. Now, this is the way most Japanese actually lived. This is Hida village outside of Takayama. Really cool place. I strongly recommend it. All of this is fake in the sense that these structures are actually real buildings. But some wealthy guy back about 1980, something like that, became really worried the fact that Japanese were losing their heritage. So what he did is he went through Japan and had folks buy up old abandoned farmhouses and stuff like that all across Japan. And he made a modern village. The equivalent of in the United States would be Williamsburg, which is exactly the same. In Virginia is again a bunch of buildings taken from all parts of New England and stuff put together to make a reconstruction of a New England town. Hida Village is the same thing for sort of like rural Japan. But this is what Japanese would have lived in, probably for the last 2,000 years. In fact, many Japanese were living in something like this right down to the 1930s, 40s, in the northern parts of Honshu right in the 1960s. So key thing here is the folks that lived in this would be part of the Bay. They would not be part of the clan. They would be the folks underneath them that did not have a last name. And so what you get is collective families, large, fairly large numbers of people, all related, but without a last name, if that makes sense. This is Takayama, which I strongly recommend. It's one of the last what I call craft sake brewing places in Japan. It's the Hida Village is just outside. They've got 4 streets that are basically old streets from the early 19th century, late Tokugawa period. They're obviously paved now, but these streets, a lot of these buildings are actually 300, 400, maybe 500 years old. And this is what a Japanese urban area looked like. Totally different than its Chinese counterpart. There's no walls. There's no idea of the inside, outside the city, and outside of the city. The bureaucracy is down at the end of town. There's still the original sort of, if you want to call it, samurai headquarters. We're down there for the Takayama clan. So this place was managed by one of these clans, subsidiary to the ruling clans. But it was Takayama was, I can't remember what the name of the clan was. It was in charge of this town. Their name is Takayama. And so the folks that lived in this, some of these folks would be clan members. Other folks would just be folks, that were part of part of a group of people under the control of the samurai that ran this town. And they, this is a brewery, that's a brewery. I can't remember which one. I think there's 2 of the breweries right here. And one of the things that you did in this part of Japan is you brewed sake. And so, but these folks wouldn't have had a last name. If you have a last name like Brewer in England, that means that your family originally brewed beer. It's in Japan, they didn't. So there's a real strange sort of missing chunk of identity, which we'll get into next time, is absolutely fascinating when you think of contemporary Japanese now fixated there on last names. Their great-great-great-grandparents didn't have a last name. Now, one of the side aspects of continuity is that people didn't move around. In fact, in Japanese history, until basically almost the post-World War II, people weren't allowed to move around. You only could move if you had permission of the authorities. So in most of Japanese history, people pretty much stayed in the same place. One of the side effects of that is you end up with incredibly strong neighborhood or neighborhood or neighbor social networks. And this replaces a lot of what would be bureaucratic in other parts of the world, even certainly in China and even in Korea. So neighbors became hugely important to how people function and how they operated. In Takayama, it sort of makes sense if you visit that little street, since people lived upstairs, the shop is downstairs. It'd be sort of obvious that people are going to get close to their neighbors because they're interacting with them 24/7, basically. This is where are we? We're somewhere in Kyoto, I'm pretty sure. This is an older neighborhood. This particular structure here is probably about 200, 300, maybe 400 years old. This one here is brand new or pretty close to it. But nonetheless, what you'd find is these folks here are the same folks that have been in that place, in that location for maybe 400 or 500 years. The structures might change, but where you stay relative to your neighbors doesn't. This makes it radically different. Chinese tend to have that at the village level, but not to the same extent. Koreans, I'm not too sure about. But in Japan, what you find is the folks that live on the street have been on the street for a really, 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 really long time. The building they live in might change, but where you live doesn't. And your relationships with your neighbors don't change. So Japanese society is not Chinese society with a spin. It's an entirely different society. It's probably more complicated because a lot of these superficial aspects, like the outfits the women were at the wedding, are actually taken from other cultures around them, Korea, China, wherever. But the way that they're played out is uniquely Japanese. This is probably one of the key things I want you guys to get. Japanese society is not like Chinese society. It's at least as different as British society is from say, Russian society. They happen to be relatively close to each other, but what they have in common is almost more defined by the differences than the shared parts. Japanese society has almost nothing in common with Chinese society in most ways. This is something that the Japanese and the Chinese are very aware of. But for foreigners, especially Americans who have no clue about their own culture, much less anyone else's, we tend to package everyone as the same thing.